amplifying the quiet radicalism of Frances MacDonald McNair. As to the ghoul-like designs of the Mrs. MacDonald, they were simply hideous, and the less said about them the better. In November of 1894, the Scottish satirical magazine Quiz published this scathing comment regarding works by sisters Margaret and Frances MacDonald, displayed at the Glasgow School of Art Club exhibition. It continued, "Decidedly, the authorities should not halt till such offences are brought within the scope of the further powers. Suggesting that the police should handle the women's art as they would the drunken vagabonds and errant children in the streets of Glasgow, the tone and tenor of the critique is crystal clear. These women and their art were socially dangerous." Without a catalogue from the exhibition, and given the paucity of surviving pieces from the women in general, it is impossible to know exactly which images elicited such a response. However, a quick perusal at other criticisms to the extant oeuvre of Frances MacDonald McNair in particular reveals additional disapproval towards a curious artistic mind at work. The incomprehensible symbolism, strangely formed figures, sexual ambiguity, and surreal compositions of her work pushed the boundaries of modernism in design and radically challenged established Victorian gender norms at the end of the 19th century. Born and raised in England until the 1880s, when her Glaswegian father returned the family to his homeland, Frances's early life was one of comfort and gentility. Though not a member of the gentry himself, John MacDonald was an engineer and agent for a major landowner in Chesterton, England. This position afforded the MacDonald children an upper-class education and, upon moving back to Scotland, financial security that allowed Frances and her sister to study art. Frances's artistic life began in 1890, when she and her sister Margaret enrolled at the Glasgow School of Art. Unlike many other women in late 19th century Scotland, the value of this education for the MacDonald sisters was not in the gaining of marketable skills that would allow them financial independence, but in the exploration of artistic styles, materials, and expressions that would satisfy them creatively. In short, the various expectations placed upon women whose goal was to create works for the competitive open market did not guide, nor did it hinder or restrain, the sisters' artistic study and production. Frances, who I will call MacDonald throughout the remainder of this paper, seemed particularly to flourish in this freedom, embracing the Glasgow style and then exploring and expanding that style in order to find and exercise her own artistic voice. Before I begin, I must address a major obstacle to any study of MacDonald's body of work, the fact that a large portion of it no longer exists. MacDonald married Herbert McNair in 1899, and the couple had one son during their 21-year marriage. By all accounts, their relationship was ostensibly happy, but perpetually challenged. Though they lived in Liverpool for a short time after their marriage, the closure of the School of Architecture and Applied Art where McNair taught, and the loss of his family's wealth in a bad business venture, produced extreme strife and brought the couple back to Glasgow in 1909. MacDonald continued to work and, in fact, produced some of her most intriguing images during the last decades of her life. MacDonald committed suicide in 1921 at the age of 48, and though the cause of her death is often avoided by scholars, they are clear to articulate McNair's response to the event. He took all of the work still in his possession and destroyed it. The loss of a large portion of her oeuvre is certainly tragic, and if one is looking to espouse confidently upon the development and maturation of her creations over time, particularly problematic. This paper will discuss a handful of surviving works by MacDonald, with particular attention to how she radically challenged both the contemporary notions of gender and the stylistic tendencies of her age. In the 1890s, while studying at the Glasgow School of Art, MacDonald began exploring the world of graphic design and illustration in a manner that was not only radical for the time, but also radical for a member of the female gender. Her creation, titled A Pond, was first published in the November 1894 issue of Magazine. Though it is not certain that the response to her work that appeared in numerous critical reviews around 1894 were in direct relation to this piece, comments about her weird designs, her impossible forms, lurid color and symbolism, and her fearfully, wonderfully, and weirdly new art seem appropriately evoked by A Pond. It is quite clear from just a casual glance at this object in comparison to the typical production of the time that MacDonald was not content to work within the expectations and constraints of the standard style. The viewer is granted temporary comfort by their perfectly balanced and symmetrical composition. However, the strange wash of dissonant colors and the bizarre shapes of the two figures quickly demolish this sensation. The elongated and severe figure's outstretched palms gesture both in offering and acceptance, as transparent draperies flow over their sinuous bodies. Behind the forms, uncanny balloon-like objects continue to distort and challenge the gaze, rising up toward a simplistic landscape and bending inward toward one another, mimicking the motion of the human figures below. MacDonald's disinterest in adhering to the stylistic conventions of the late 19th century is made apparent by the combination of distorted forms, surrealistic environment, and indecipherable subject matter. These elements, considered individually, might be exemplary of an acceptable stylistic risk. Compiled, they are a clear and purposeful challenge to norms and expectations. Though MacDonald embraces the graphic nature and decorative structure of the Art Nouveau movement, she confidently eschews the style's stereotypical beauty and aesthetically pleasing composition. In describing the figures in a pond, Jude Burkhauser confidently states, quote, "The grotesque, androgynous, and sexually self-contained female persona portrayed here had little in common with images of women seen in the work of the pre-Raphaelites." End quote. While I have no argument with the comparison of MacDonald's work to the pre-Raphaelites, there is clearly very little correlation that can be made between these grim forms and the classical beauties of her contemporaries. I believe that her figural forms in a pond beg for a more nuanced interpretation of gender representation. In short, while I am willing to temporarily allow for the term androgyny to be in play, I am not at all convinced that the female gender can confidently be ascribed to the bodies in this work. Though the two forms have some attributes that might be read immediately as feminine, fuller lips, long eyelashes, and what appears to be long hair in the form of the maroon bubble-like objects behind their heads, the figures lack any additional anatomical definition that would identify them as either female or male. While some of her later works explore androgyny and heteronormativity, this piece seems to grapple more directly with gender construction, by representing human forms that are neither male nor female, nor even a combination of both, but effectively gender-neutral or genderless. While certainly androgynous, the indefinite nature of the forms hinders identification of either male or female anatomy. This disallows the opportunity to align elements with one or the other. Instead, the viewer must be left in the liminal space between, the disconcerting and confusing location where the figures are not both or either, but neither. Additionally, the remainder of the composition also challenges notions of gender as a simple binary. The swelling maroon forms that swim upward from the bottom of the composition are curiously sperm-like, with their tails trailing behind them as they ascend. Oddly, portions of those same objects seem to create quasi-vaginal or uterine forms between and around the figures. By allowing these compositional elements to manifest both genders, identity is further conflated and the confrontation with the viewer continues. Even the title, A Pond, symbolically alludes to the womb in which cells combine to create new life that, until realized through birth, is effectively genderless. While other works by MacDonald and her sister from the same time period have similar stylistic tendencies in relation to the figural form, they also depict figures that are conspicuously and definitively female. Though also spindly and sinewy, the figures have long flowing hair and clearly defined breasts that leave their gender identity beyond question. A Pond stands, therefore, as one image in MacDonald's repertoire that explores gender in a truly revolutionary fashion. For the remainder of this paper, I wish to use the same lenses of style and gender to explore three images from a series of pencil and watercolor works on vellum that MacDonald created sometime after 1911. It is notable that these works were created between the financial ruin that forced MacDonald and McNair to return to Glasgow in 1909 and MacDonald's death in 1921. These years could hardly be described as happy. As McNair struggled to find work and eventually turned to heavy drinking, MacDonald was left to care for their son and attempt to stay financially afloat. Details of the last decade of her life are scant, as she and McNair separated and reunited and came and went in Glasgow. This lack of concrete data impacts the discussion here, as the works under scrutiny appear in different texts, with various titles and various dates of production. Pamela Robertson notes in the catalogue raisonné for both MacDonald and McNair, called Doves and Dreams, that the titles used within are, quote, based on family tradition, and that while some seem to match the subjects depicted, others are less clear. Since the title of a work will often encourage a particular symbolic read or understanding, I will attempt to consider the works in light of and despite of the various titles assigned. Even with this complication, the images stand as a remarkable selection of works that continue to illuminate upon MacDonald's nonconformity. Eve or Sleep, Man makes the beads of life, but woman must thread them, and 'Tis a long path which wanders to desire, are three select images from a larger group of works that display MacDonald's continued exploration of style and curious depiction of gender and sexuality. The three images feature similar compositional constructions, with a single figure appearing in the foreground of the image. Additional figures appear either beside or behind the primary form and exist within surreal landscapes where they are surrounded by various decorative elements. With comparable color palettes, materials, and sizes, the similarities between the three images support the read that they were all completed around the same time, after 1911 and around 1914. Robertson rightly notes that, quote, if there is a unifying theme, it is one of meditation on a woman's spiritual and physical being. Issues of choice, loss, redemption, motherhood, love, fulfillment, entrapment can all be read into these layered compositions, end quote. Further exploration of issues of love might lead to a more complex understandings of these images as representations of MacDonald's attitude toward and ideas about gender and sexuality. Though the three images selected share a visual style and can be viewed as a collection of representations that grapple with a shared subject, they can also be read as clear and individual statements of MacDonald's perceptions on the hegemonic norms of gender and sexuality in the early 20th century. Man makes the beads, but woman must thread them, is the clearest and most direct image of the three in its obvious commentary on the expectations placed on women at the turn of the century. The male figure at the right, free amid a swirling landscape, thrusts a bead into the already crowded necklace that encircles the female figure. The bead, within which a fetal human figure appears, becomes another link in the chain of expectations and responsibilities placed upon woman and womanhood. The circular elements of MacDonald's work that appear elsewhere as forms that unite figures together here seem to weigh down the female form. Her head bows low as the heaviness of the many beads hangs about her neck, and her arms are pulled downward and straight by the child grasped between her hands. Her simplistic and beautiful face wears an expression of calm detachment that seems mixed, ever so slightly, with sadness. She is resolute in her role as woman, mother, creator, even as her role as the threader of beads is foisted upon her by the external world. MacDonald's woman here is part and parcel of the standard structure of the heteronormative world, and the image seems to both marvel at the woman's ability to persevere and to openly lament the circumstance itself. When we turn to the other images, Eve or Sleep and 'Tis a long path which wanders to desire, one gets the sense that MacDonald's artistic exploration can be read as a curious commentary on both gender and sexuality. 'Tis a Long Path depicts a stylized female figure at the center, whose long hair stretches out from the sides of her head and becomes entwined with the curvilinear forms of the distant landscape. She stands at one end of a twisting path that leads from the foreground through the composition, compelling our eyes to dwell upon the other two figures in the image. All of the figures are nude, and all three gesture dramatically for the viewer. The main protagonist raises her hands up toward her face in a sort of shrug of exasperation. The second figure at the right embraces their own form with tightly gripping fingers, and the third figure at the back, left, throws their head backward and their arms outward as if exposing themselves to the natural world. The three figures seem unaware of and disengaged from one another, though the leading lines of the twisting path draw a connection between them that demands exploration. If, as the title suggests, the path is leading toward desire, then the figure at the rear of the image could be read as personifying the end goal of the journey. With arms reaching outward, desire seems to stand triumphant at the far end of the twisting path, awaiting the arrival and embrace of one of the other figures, both of whom seem immobilized by their own fears or insecurities. Incapable of traversing the distance along the long path that leads back to desire, the figures are trapped within the confines of their current positions on the surface. Though desire awaits them with open arms, they are either too preoccupied with self-preservation, arms wrapped tightly around their own form and protection, or too flustered by the predicament of life to notice. In another interesting twist, the figure of desire is androgynously depicted, declaratively neither male nor female. In the style of this series of images, MacDonald's male forms often appear with ear or shoulder-length cropped hair that creates a sort of geometric halo about their heads. As such, one can read the body at the right as decidedly male. And with long hair and visible breasts, MacDonald defines the central figure as definitively female. Desire lacks either the square or flowing locks of MacDonald's male and female characters. Instead, their hair is swallowed up within the blue, glassy, lake-like form that rings their upper torso. Moreover, the figure could be read as having breasts, as there are curving lines that seem to delineate the chest of the figure, but perhaps those are just lines of musculature that are not meant to denote gender at all. Either way, MacDonald seems to be forcing a read of desire as, at the very least, androgynous in nature, if not, like the figures in a pond, genderless or gender-neutral. As such, the fact that both a female and male figure walk the path toward a non-binary figure of desire speaks to the way in which MacDonald physically embodied the conception of longing. Whether the human form stands in for sexual desire or simply the mortal pursuit of happiness through the attainment of what one desires, the tension inherent in the enigmatic gendering of the figure is tangible. A similar tension appears in the image of Eve or Sleep, where a singular form looms largely at the left while pairs of coupled bodies appear at the right in decreasing size and clarity. Given the stylistic tendencies of MacDonald's work, the couple at the lower right can be articulated as male and female. In the middle ground, one figure appears decidedly female, but her form obscures enough of her companion as to make defining their gender problematic. This is true again in the smallest pair at the top right. While flowing hair and garment indicate a female form, her companion is so undefined as to hardly appear conclusively human, and certainly cannot be assigned a gender identity. When brought into visual and interpretive conversation with the large white body at the left, the image becomes a tantalizing commentary on love. Alone and performing a gesture of weeping, the largest figure is brought into connection with the paired lovers through MacDonald's aesthetic element of the circle. The ring surrounds the lone woman, while the paired figures stand just outside of it, scattering heart-shaped confetti at her feet as if to compound her isolation. The circular element indicates a desire to be connected to others, but the separation that it creates can be read as MacDonald's struggles with her own marriage and partnership. Even though connections are near and possible, MacDonald presents an image in which the singular female is incapable of escaping the confines of her current state of being, a sensation with which MacDonald must have been intimately familiar in the decade prior to her death. The many lacunae in her life makes definitive discussion of her own sexual orientation problematic, but a close read of her representations of human forms throughout her career suggests that MacDonald consistently produced images that explored the boundaries of gender in a profoundly radical way. Amid the growing suffrage movement and an ever-increasing desire for women's freedom, MacDonald's depiction of figures that reject gender conformity illustrates one way for those boundaries and restrictions to be lifted and destroyed. Her erasure of gender amid images of lovers also creates a curiously radical commentary on sexuality that can be read as a reflection of her own attitudes toward love and partnership. The most important relationships in MacDonald's life were fraught with difficulty. Her marriage to McNair was consistently challenging, and her close relationship and artistic partnership with her sister Margaret suffered due to the geographical distance that often separated them. In this way, whether her images are read in terms of romantic or familial love, they can be located within the biographical story of her life. This, combined with her consistently risky artistic style, makes MacDonald a curious and radical figure in the modernist movement at the turn of the century. Thank you.